Hey everyone, welcome to a new video on painting Abaddon the Despoiler. In this one we're going to work on the black armour and the gold trim. Now these parts obviously make up most of the model. I think the face is the most difficult, but the black and the gold obviously is a huge part of the model in terms of physical space, and it's probably going to take the longest. I always like details that you can paint in one session. For example, the cloth in between the legs, I could do that in an evening or something like that. What I find difficult is when something feels like it's dragging on, like painting an armor and spending night after night on it. That can get quite boring. So I do think it's really nice to get to this point when you've only got smaller details that you can do in a session. And it's quite nice from making a tutorial point of view as well, because you can break it up and nothing takes too long to record. So let's get into it, and I've painted the whole thing with matte black first of all, and I'm going to start with some scale 75 Eclipse grey here and just start to sketch in and plan where my highlights are going to be. And you want this to be a pretty big old highlight because it's quite a dark grey, and just start to get a feel where you want the light to hit. I actually think I did these highlights too big because I had to repaint a lot of black later on, which was quite time consuming to glaze the black in. So I would say try and be quite accurate at this stage, trying to get a nice broad highlight, but not occupying quite as much space as I did here. Dilution, you can dilute this paint pretty thin. Obviously it's a dark grey over black, so you don't have any coverage issues. And the main thing is just to get a feel for where you want to put the highlights and lay down a nice smooth matte grey to start with. We're going to be painting a kind of OSL effect coming from the blue sword. So there's going to be two black recipes in this video. We can start them all off with Eclipse grey to begin with, but then where the sword is, we're going to tail off and add more blue, and then we'll do a different recipe on the other side. So for the blue side, I'm going to be using scale 75 again with the Caribbean blue, and I might use a little bit of pastel blue as well if I want to make it lighter. So basically we're just going to mix these blues in with the Eclipse grey, and we always want to have a little bit of Eclipse grey mixed in so it's not too saturated. If we use Caribbean blue on its own, I think it'll be too dominant and too overpowering. So here I'm just adding Caribbean blue until it's kind of, the right tone. So it's not too blue, not too grey. It depends how strong your light source is, but this is going to be like a kind of reasonably subtle glow coming from the blue sword. And I'm going to be using Caribbean blue for the sword, so obviously that works well. Eventually I'll start adding the pastel blue here, and you can see that lightens it up without making it too blue. If we go to pure Caribbean, like I said, I think it'll be too overpowering. So now we're just going to start layering, and it's important that we highlight the part of the leg that's going to be closest to the sword, so make sure you check that. The sword's obviously the only thing I've painted off of the model, and I really need it off the model to get access to this part and also to paint the sword really well, but you can sort of make an estimation and adjust it later. You can see this first grey is quite subtle, so that means it's going to work for parts that are quite far away, up on the chest, up on the shoulders and the hip plates. And what we'll do is we'll keep adding stronger blue, and we'll stop highlighting the parts that are quite far away from the sword, just to build that intensity all towards the thing that's closest to it, which is that shin part, which is quite lucky as the shin is a nice large area to paint. I was quite reserved with that first mix. As you can see, it's barely blue at all, and now I am a lot bolder and I've added a fair amount of Caribbean blue. So you can go in cautious and just see what it's looking like. But yeah, I've actually got quite a large amount of Caribbean blue in the mix now. You can see because there's some Eclipse grey in there, which will desaturate it really quickly, it still doesn't look too crazy. So I can definitely use this colour for places like the hip plate up here. Eventually when we get to the bright tones, that's when we'll stop with these parts. So I've just blue tacked the sword on quickly before I go any further, And you can just see it's facing that bottom half of the sword. So this is just to check that it's right and all the parts you're working on actually the sword has access to. In other words, the sword will affect it. The shoulder pad might not affect it, but we'll do it blue for now anyway, and we can always change it. But yeah, you can see I've got more or less the right place. I think I need to bring it round a little further to the side. So I'm focusing on the part directly opposite the sword, and we're going to build up the intensity around there. So again, a bit more Caribbean blue in the mix. I probably made this a lot bluer than when I showed you on the palette, but it still has some grey in it, just to slightly take away from the colour. But here you can see I'm just working with simple layering. It's about getting the colour and more importantly the intensity correct, and the shapes of the highlights are the most important thing. So we're not using any complicated techniques, it's just layering. It's all about your accuracy of how wide it is, how bright it is, and the precise placement. So, I don't think you need to use any more difficult to use techniques. It's just get those positions correct. Here you've got a nice close up, and you can see I'm just working with small little brush marks, building that up gradually. Eventually, like when we looked at the palette, I start adding that pastel blue. And this is a very desaturated colour, so actually when you add it, it's not going to be a crazy strong blue. It'll work really nicely for having that kind of ethereal glow that I intend on doing from the sword. And the technique isn't going to change, we're just going to layer as we go on and just try and bring it up to the right sort of intensity. And at this point, I'm not really sure how bright I want it to be. Obviously, it depends on how close the sword is and how bright the sword is. And going back to that artwork I referenced in the first video, the sword is pretty bright and I think I will do that myself. So I'm just going to use my judgment as I'm layering and stop when I think it looks a bit too bright. The upper plates, like on the hip, they'll get a little bit of a highlight on the bottom, on the edges, but all of it really should be around the shin because that's the only part that's really close to the sword. But this entire side, we're going to try and have a little bit of a blue glow, and going back to the face, we obviously added in that blue grey and that pastel blue to that skin to try and make that work as well. I stopped painting the entire length of the shin as well, and I kind of find a spot that's directly opposite the sword to do an ovalish kind of shaped highlight, just to really be accurate to where it lines up with the sword. It's funny watching footage back actually, because I made loads of changes and corrections because I wasn't sure about this, and there's definitely points where it looks good and I think it could be better and I make it worse, so it's quite painful watching this video footage back sometimes because I'm like, I wish I left it at that point because that looks fantastic. So hopefully you can watch the video and judge for yourself where it looks best and where to leave it better than me. After I finish or almost finished that blue section, I thought it'd be a good idea to just base coat all the gold trim because having other colours on there can alter your perception of what something's looking like. And I'm going to be using Scale 75 Artist Burnt Umber. You could just use Rhinox Hide. I'm using Burnt Umber because it's a colder brown and it's a little bit darker. You could even use black and a bit of Rhinox Hide, to be honest. That's probably the easiest solution. And I'm going to mix that in with my Decayed Metal metallic paint. And this is just to make sure my shadows are really dark and slightly matter than Decayed Metal on its own, which is actually still a pretty shiny paint. So you can see with that nice dark brown metallic on, it does alter our perception. And what I'm doing here is just going back in with AK Black and just adjusting the volumes. And this is where I said earlier, I painted too much Eclipse Grey on and I had to repaint this. But I do prefer just starting black and layering up. So I just wish I did the highlights slightly smaller at the start. For the black recipe for the rest of the model, I wanted to do a slightly violet purplish tone to it. And I used Eclipse Grey again, and I'm using Pastel Violet here. And I don't think this was a mistake because it's a fantastic colour. But what I found was you kept adding the violet And there were points where the grey looked fantastic, like this slightly soft and subtle violet tone. But eventually, when you keep adding the violet, it does get, too purple basically. So I also have this medium grey from AK, and I'm using a mix of both of those. So if you want it to be simple, then just use medium grey and eclipse grey, and I actually think that's all you need. But if you want to experiment with a slightly more purple tone, add a little bit of pastel violet, and before it gets too purple, you can start adding in that medium grey. In retrospect, I would probably just do eclipse grey with the medium grey because there is a little bit of purple tone to the eclipse anyway, and that's probably enough. And with the other colours going on the model, it's quite nice to not have a complex black. So just looking at the side there, you can see the transition going from black to eclipse grey, and it's quite a nice beginning actually. A bit too subtle. We do want a few more highlights than just eclipse grey. So I just do my first step of eclipse grey with a little bit of the pastel violet added. Now with all of these steps, I'm trying to be very careful. So I'm diluting it a reasonable amount so it's translucent and I can build up those layers gradually. I'm using quite a small brush, a 2-0 here, and that's just for accuracy because we're going to be painting quite tight, small volumes. So what I'm looking to do is paint quite a large highlight, leaving just a little bit of the eclipse grey at this point. And it's all about just taking your time, layering it, getting it really flat and smooth, and then you can adjust the highlight shapes easily later on. If it gets too thick, then you can't really correct that. So it's fine to get the volumes wrong, but you want to apply the paint nicely at all times. So just like the blue, we're just going to carry on layering, nothing complicated. I'm just adding a little bit of pastel violet at a time. And some parts, like the chest here, I do want to be slightly brighter. Obviously on the face we have that really dark shadow, and that's kind of caused by the hooded part anyway. But I still would like this one side to be not super dark. So I'm going to put my focus of the highlights on the upper chest, the shoulder pads, but really parts like the shin, I want to keep them quite low lighting. So I'll probably do 2 or 3 stages for that, and then maybe 3 or 4 steps for kind of the chest and shoulder area. To get a smooth blend with layering, I use quite small little brush marks, and this is to give a slight textured effect as well. But basically it's similar to stippling, but instead of dots, we're going to use small lines, and that's kind of like cross hatching to build up a transition, and that's easier than if you do a straight line or a straight shape. So it is time consuming. That's probably not the only negative, but the biggest negative. But the thing I like about it is I get loads of control, and I'm happy to put the extra time in to get the results. But what it does allow me is that I know I can get a nice transition, kind of guaranteed at the end, unlike something like wet blending, which isn't a guarantee. And I actually like the look of having all those physical layers and how it looks with the texture in the end. So that's why it's not the most exciting or particularly complicated technique, but it gets the aesthetic that I'm after. Eventually, after layering, we get to a point like here, and at the time I felt like these highlights were too bright, but actually I think they're quite nice. So I used glazes of the previous mixes. Eclipse Grey is a bit too dark to use straight away, so I did make a glaze which was Eclipse Grey and a little bit of violet, and I just diluted that a lot to kind of soften up these highlights. I actually ended up later reapplying brighter ones, so this was a back and forth process. I layered up, glazed to knock it back. I felt I knocked it back too much and had to reapply some highlights. So don't get frustrated if you're doing this yourself, especially if this is new for you, painting these big area highlights or in this style. Just like I said, take your time, analyze each part, and as long as you're applying the paint nicely, that is diluted correctly, you can fix these things. Not unlimited amounts, but you do get a degree of playing with it and adjusting and stuff like that. And again, like I said earlier, it's just funny because at the time I was like, this is too bright. And I'm looking at this video footage thinking actually it's quite cool. So it'd be interesting to get your perspective on this as well. When you feel you've got the right contrast on the grey and it's all transitioned nicely, I do finish with some pure black glazes. Now with black, you have to really dilute it a lot for a glaze. So, glazes are hard to tell you what the ratio is because it really depends on how good your work is that you've done and also the paint you're using. But with black, you can afford to dilute this a lot. So just make sure you practice on maybe a part that's not so important, like the back of the leg, as opposed to the chest or a focal area. But just try and get used to the dilution depending on your paint. And with glazes, they're just for adjusting. They don't save everything. So it really does depend on how good your initial work is. If it needs just a slight adjustment, obviously you dilute that even further. If you really need to change it, then actually it's not going to be a glaze that you need. It's going to be some slightly thicker layers just to really get the paint in the right place. Eventually it got to a point where I felt like I was almost finished, but I had to make sure there was a nice interaction or transition from the violet side into the blue side. And I thought down the middle of the shin, pure black would be too strong. So actually I just had Eclipse grey here. And that meant there was a slightly softer transition between these two volume highlights and things like that. So yeah, I thought probably the sword would be able to reach quite a lot of this area and it wouldn't go to pure black. I just saved pure black for the inside of the leg, I think. Looking at it here, I really like the colour we've got for the black on the violet side. I'm not too happy with the shape of the highlight on the blue, but I might just change that when the sword's glued on, to be honest. We have to make a call on it. But yeah, a really nice point to get to. I definitely like the recipes that I've chosen for both these blacks. And I think now we need to paint the gold and perhaps adjust any of the black that we need to after the gold is finished. So the base coat of the gold was already finished, which was decayed metal and burnt umber. So my first layer of highlight was going to be decayed metal on its own. And it's not much brighter, but it is a lot shinier. So, there's going to be a real difference between that matte shadow compared to anything you paint with decayed metal now. And I try to be quite reserved with this. So basically my philosophy on the gold for Abaddon was to have most of it in this really dark colour, otherwise it would be too shiny and it wouldn't suit his character or the atmosphere I was trying to create. So I left most of it in this dark matte brown and tried to do minimal small highlights, kind of like I would do non-metallic metal, leaving a lot of shadow and then nice bright highlights. When I was happy with that, I added some Peridot alchemy into the decayed metal, roughly, half and half. And this is where I started to do very controlled little highlights, as you can see on the face of that shin kind of detail here. So I was trying to follow the light source from the right and just build up in layers here nice and slowly. Metallics are hard to blend, so I try not to do too many increments. I'm focusing on exactly where the highlights are. So for me, it's more about precision. And I edge highlight all of these arrows and the rivets and just pick out all the details with this color really. But I think with that matte kind of base coat, it's much easier to see where you're going with the metallics. I used to find edge highlighting metallics really hard, but having a slightly matter base really makes it easy to see where you're going. And once you've put edge highlights on all of these details, I think it looks really nice actually. And you don't need to do too much more in the shadow areas like here on the inside. Otherwise if you highlight it more, it's going to draw too much attention to it, especially as it's metallic and it's going to bounce off that light. So yeah, you don't need to go overboard with the metallics. Just be nice and tight, nice and neat, and make sure you're leaving plenty of shadow to keep the dark feeling of the whole figure. After you've done that, that'll probably take you the longest, as I do think it looks good to do a little edge on every section. Normally I'm not that into edge highlights, but I think for the metal trim, it's a really nice way to frame it. What we're going to do now is move on to pure peridot alchemy. Obviously we used a mix before, so now we're just going to use it on its own. And you're going to repeat the step before, but really tighten up the volumes and do it in far fewer places. So little places like on the hip plate, around the face of the knee, and one of the big parts is going to be around the face areas, so the top of the shoulder pads and all of that. But I found this step was really fast just because it's quite a bright colour, and if you use it too much, it changes the overall appearance of Abaddon. You don't want him to have this nice dark black and the broody face painting and then have loads of bright bling gold everywhere. So you need this highlight in certain places, but I would say be nice and reserved with it. We need to continue the OSL effect on the leg into the metallics, and this is something I did on my Elder Farseer tutorial a while back, and that is going to be mixing again matte and metallic paints together to try and get the right effect. Luckily, Peridot Alchemy, as you can see, is already kind of bluish greenish, so it's not a million miles away. So I'm going to take my Caribbean blue and just add a little bit of that into the Peridot Alchemy. If you add just a tiny bit, it's going to slightly change it very subtly, and it still looks really, really metallic. Actually, it just looks very green at this point, but still a very usable metallic. It's not going to be too matte. Then if I add some more, it still feels like a metallic, but obviously it is going to be slightly duller, and we are getting a little bit more closer to a regular matte paint. But experiment with it, mix them on the palette, and you'll find the right mix, and it also dilutes into a glaze really well. If I need to, I'm going to add some pastel blue if I need to lighten it up for some sharper edges and stuff like that. So I begin by kind of testing it out, doing a little bit of an edge highlight here, and eventually I go, well, it's fine, it needs to be more than that. And I use the reasonably diluted mix of the Caribbean and the Peridot Alchemy, and I actually paint most of the area. You think it's going to have a slight tint for all of this gold, so I think the kind of first mix where we had just a little bit of Caribbean blue is going to work for almost all of this part of the shin. Obviously, you want to follow the highlight that you've put in the black part. Once that's looking good, the first layer, I add a little more of the Caribbean blue, and I'm just layering it up. And I'm going carefully just to check I've got the intensity right. Obviously, I don't want it to be too blue and at the same time too matte. I do think that this works really well. We can mix these paints together and it looks fantastic, but it will get to a point where it looks slightly odd. With the little spikes and things, I actually paint most of the underside of these because I think the sword is going to be facing upwards, and that helps to make it feel like an OSL effect, having the kind of more gold colours on the top. You can push this effect as far or as little as you want to. I ended up covering more of the area with this mix of blue because I absolutely love the look of it, to be honest. If you're not so sure, then obviously you can rein it back, but I think it really adds to the atmosphere, and it's nice to use metallic paints, but also be able to include this OSL effect. You obviously could just do some coloured inks and glaze that over the top, but I like the reduction in shine for the metallics, and it gives you more control, both with your brushwork and the look of it. We just don't want to mix so much matte paint in that it becomes purely matte. But I think once you try it out, you'll get a feel for it and see for yourself. I try out doing a little bit of verdigris, and that is with a mix of Eclipse Grey and Caribbean Blue that we used kind of earlier. And I think that's nice to kind of just break up the rivets, and it also just ties together that blue colour we have on one side. I don't want too much of this. I did just literally add it to a couple rivets where I felt it looked a little bit boring and needed some breaking up in areas. So just taking a step back and looking at the model as a whole, as you turn it, I hope you agree that this green effect on the metallics works really well, and it helps to tie it together and become a little more harmonious with the black OSL effect. So personally, I'm really happy with it, especially how it looks in hand. It's always hard to, talk about metallics and video it, but I hope you can appreciate that. I think it really works. We've used matte browns for the shadows, and we've used matte blue to make sure it works in harmony and get the OSL. And I think painting metallics in this way is kind of important to me because we can't get that kind of dull, atmospheric, evil effect for a character like Abaddon if he's got really, really shiny gold all over him. And I prefer mixing the matte paints as opposed to using a wash or something like that. I think it gets a better aesthetic and finish overall. After filming, I did make some adjustments. Looking at this shot here, this is where I knocked the black right back, and I was trying to be more subtle and, try and not go overboard, which is something I tend to do. However, looking at this photo, I don't think I've got enough punch in the black. It's fine for all of the areas, like the hip plate, the hand, but actually the shoulder and the top of the chest just needs more intensity. It needs to match the head and also the gold highlight. You can see I'm actually really happy with how that highlight looks on the gold, but the intensity doesn't really match with the black. So all I did was just slightly brighten up these highlights. I actually used the medium grey, which I hadn't before, just to make sure it didn't look too violet. So I had my mix of Eclipse grey and violet, and then I just added some medium grey and carefully layered up just these two little parts actually to make sure I had a little more light around these areas. I think it's important that you don't highlight all of the black really bright because then it will look a little strange, but I just felt these two spots, especially from the front view, needed that little bit of extra light. I added a bit more highlight to the part on the fist, but I completely left alone the legs and the hip plates and stuff just to make sure they drop into the shadow and you get that kind of overall light effect. Looking at the other angle, I did the same thing for the shoulder only. I felt this part of the shoulder needed a brighter highlight, and it probably shouldn't be the blue one actually, as the sword isn't going to be able to reach up there. So I switched to my more neutral recipe, the same as I'd just done, and I think that's an improvement as well. So just a couple little tweaks, and to be honest, I might tweak some more stuff as I go, but the recipes won't change. Just neatening things up and getting those gold highlights a bit tighter at some point as well. But I wanted to get a video out to you, so I might try and improve some stuff, but it will all be the same methods. I like this view of the side, and like I said, I'm really happy with using the blue mixed with the metallics. I think that's a nice interaction. I think it's a lovely colour, and it does recreate that eerie atmosphere from the sword that I was looking for. So I'm very excited to paint the sword and stick it on and hope that that all works together. It might need some changes when the sword is on, but I think I've been careful enough putting the sword, blue tacking it on occasionally to make sure I've judged that correctly. I'm liking how it's all working together. The face looks really good now. We've got other colours on there. When you just have this bright face and everything else is black, I was worried I'd over highlighted it, but again, looking here, I think it looks cool, and the red highlights on the hair aren't so overpowering now because we have other stuff going on. It's really important that you paint other areas before you make a real judgment call because everything is by comparison. So paint one detail and it can drive you nuts because you think it looks bad, but now we have other stuff around it. I'm starting to really get into this. As I said at the start of the video, we've got the face, we've got the black, we've got the gold, we've really got the bulk of the model, the important things, well, not important things, the major things done. I think my next job is going to be maybe to do the sword. I can't decide yet. You'll have to find out in the next tutorial, but it would be nice to get that sword glued on, starting to see him come together. So I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed the two black recipes, how to use OSL, how to use matte paints with metallics. So as well as just painting Abaddon, I hope you've got some cool stuff in here that you could use for other stuff. As usual, I love reading your comments, so let me know what you liked, what you'd like to see more of, and all that stuff. But until then, I will see you in the next video.